On the night of December 29th, 1980, three individuals would witness a massive UFO, and this event would change their lives forever. Unlike other UFO sightings and even some abductions, the witnesses would suffer appalling injuries that would hinder their lives for years and eventually lead to the death of two of them. This event is widely regarded as one of the most well documented and well studied close encounters of the second kind. Besides the three witnesses, many others would witness the craft, as well as the large number of military helicopters flying around that night. This incident became to be known as the Cash-Landrum case, named after the three witnesses. The first witness was Betty Cash. Betty then was a 51-year-old businesswoman who owned a restaurant and a grocery store. The second witness was Vicki Landrum. Vicki was 57 at the time and worked for Betty in the restaurant. Colby Landrum, Vicki's grandson, was the third witness, and at the time, he was then 7. Just outside Houston, Texas, in the town of Huffman, around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, Betty, Vicki, and Colby had been driving around the Piney Woods area of East Texas looking for a bingo game. After finding out all the games had been canceled, they decided to eat at a diner in New Caney. After finishing their meal around 8:20 p.m., Betty drove them home on Highway FM 1485, a remote road used only by people who live in the area because it is so isolated. Around 50 kilometers from Houston, the area is surprisingly sparsely populated and is covered by oak and pine trees, with swamps and lakes. Around 30 minutes later, Colby would spot a bright light above the treetops, a good distance away. He pointed it out to the women, and as they continued driving, it appeared to be getting larger and larger. Soon, though, the three would realize the object was getting closer and closer to the road, and they began to get worried. The woman thought, based on the speed it was going, they could drive by it and avoid it altogether. Soon, though, they realized the object had cut in front of them and was hovering right above the road. As they saw the burning diamond-shaped craft, Vicki screamed that they would be burned alive if they kept driving. The object was hovering and also shooting down flames of fire occasionally. As the car eventually came to a full stop, the UFO was around 60 meters away. The witnesses would later describe it as being aluminum-like and glowing so bright that it lit up the surrounding forest like daylight. The 4 points of the diamond were dull rather than sharp, and blue spots circled around the object. It also let out some type of beeping sound as well. The fire was so dense and powerful under the UFO that if it hadn't been over the road, a forest fire surely would have ensued. As they watched the diamond-shaped UFO, the car's interior and exterior became heated and hot, which prompted the three to exit the vehicle. Feeling a burning sensation on their faces, the three watched the craft in disbelief. Colby would get back in the car first and beg his grandmother to get back in, but Vicki, a devout Christian, eventually got back in but was convinced, seeing the object, it was the end of the world and that Jesus would soon appear. Becky was staring at the object in a trance-like state. Betty was so fascinated by the UFO that she walked in front of the car and stood there gazing at it. The bright light penetrated her skin, burning it, yet she stood there completely in bliss. Eventually, as the object began to hover up and away, she moved back to the car door. When she finally grabbed the car door handle, it was so painfully hot that she had to open it using her leather jacket to protect her hands. As the witnesses all were in the car and the object had left, they then realized just how hot the car was and turned the air conditioner on in the dead of winter. As the UFO began leaving, military helicopters would begin circling the area and came flying in from all directions. Some of the helicopters were identified as large double-rotor CH-47 Chinooks, which are extremely loud and undeniably used in the military. Colby would later state he counted 23 helicopters that came to the spot. These and others would then begin spreading out as the UFO was not found nearby. After the helicopters had dispersed from the scene, Betty, Vicky, and Colby drove back to Dayton, where Betty dropped Vicky and Colby off at home. Betty would return home around 9:50 p.m. There, a friend and her children were waiting for her, but Betty was already starting to feel extremely sick from the event. She was so sick, in fact, that she couldn't even tell them what happened. Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not the only ones to witness the strange events that night, though. A Dayton, Texas policeman who was off duty and his wife were driving home from Cleveland through the Huffman area, and the same night, they too also observed a large number of CH-47 helicopters. Another witness was a man living in Crosby, Texas. He was directly under the flight path of the UFO, and he reported seeing a large number of heavy military helicopters flying overhead. Jerry McDonald, who worked in the oil fields, was in the garden in the backyard in Dayton, and he reported seeing a huge UFO flying directly over his head. At first, he thought it was the Goodyear blimp, but quickly he realized it was something else. It passed about 45 meters above him, and he saw that it had two bright lights on it and a red light in the center. He was quoted as saying it was kind of diamond shaped and had two twin torches that were shooting brilliant blue flames out the back. As we see, just like Betty Cash and the Landrums, he reported seeing a diamond object with flames. While the incident itself might have been quite fascinating for the women, the aftermath was extremely painful and life-altering. While many UFO sightings and abductions lead to incredible psychological pain, seldom do many of the victims suffer intense, apparent physical pain. In the Cash-Landrum case, almost immediately the women began experiencing excruciating pain, which proves that something strange did happen on the night of December 29th, 1980. After returning home, after dropping off the Landrums, over the next few hours, Betty's skin turned red as if she had a bad sunburn. Her neck swelled, and large blisters erupted and broke out on her face. She even had blisters on her scalp and eyelids. She started to vomit and continued to do so nonstop during the night. By morning, she was even worse and almost in a coma. The Landrums would begin to experience their symptoms a bit later. Between midnight and 2 a.m., Vicky and Colby began to suffer similar symptoms, although less severe. At first they began to get something sunburn-like, but then diarrhea and vomiting ensued. The next morning, Betty was moved to Vicky's house, and all three were cared for there. Betty's condition continued to worsen, and 3 days later, she went to the hospital. The burns and swelling altered Betty's appearance so radically that a friend who came to visit her in the hospital didn't recognize her. Her hair was starting to fall out, and her eyes became so swollen she couldn't see for a week. Doctors were perplexed and confused by these symptoms and guessed that they were caused by some type of radiation. The doctors just weren't sure of what could have caused this, though, and as a safety precaution, Betty was moved into a hazmat room in the basement level of the hospital. Visits to her were limited in the beginning because doctors couldn't assess whether she was a danger to others or not. Perhaps one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence surrounding the radiation, or perhaps the case in general, comes from Brad Sparks, a nuclear radiologist who examined the case for MUFON. Sparks determined the type of radiation was not ionizing radiation, which is the only type of radiation that causes radiation sickness. Microwave and UV radiation, as well as visible light radiation, do not and cannot cause radiation sickness. It's important to note all the victims showed signs of radiation sickness. One other thing that Sparks found concerned the onset of the radiation. The three experienced the radiation sickness so quickly that if it had been ionizing radiation, they would have died in weeks. If the Cash-Landrum trio had true radiation sickness from ionizing radiation, they would have been dead within days or weeks because the onset of the symptoms was so rapid within about half an hour and so severe that as the symptoms of supposed ionizing radiation syndrome, it indicates a 100% fatal dose. This finding raises the question, what type of radiation exactly did the witnesses encounter? One fascinating thing about this case, as well, is this incident occurred the night before the Rendlesham Forest incident in England. That incident is considered one of the most famous in the world, and shockingly, there are similar characteristics between the two. Both had intense heat, and verifiable radiological after effects were associated with both events. Both events had craft that shared design elements, including diamond and pyramid shapes. Still, this isn't the first time a person has suffered similar radiological effects from a close encounter of the second kind. On May 20th, 1967, around lunchtime, Stephen Michalak, an industrial mechanic from Winnipeg, was prospecting in the Falcon Lake area of Manitoba, Canada, when he alleged to come into physical contact with a landed UFO. Michalak would later experience radiation sickness and burns. The area was examined as well and found to be radioactive. We will examine this case, regarded as one of Canada's most famous, in more detail in future episodes. After the event, John Schuessler of MUFON was one of many who would examine the event. He organized a team of specialists that were able to find additional eyewitnesses, as well as scorch marks on nearby trees. Perhaps evidence of a military cover-up was the discovery that the stretch of highway where the sighting happened was quickly repaved just days after the event. There was no paper trail with Montgomery County or the state of Texas. An unnamed witness later came forward and stated driving to work in the early dark hours, he saw a road crew paving the road where the UFO was seen. He was routed in another direction and thought it was odd at the time because both sides of the road were closed. At the time, he wasn't aware of the UFO sightings, and only later did he make the connection. A History Channel episode of UFO hunters would examine this and uncover the remote road was indeed completely replaced with new pavement. After all the suffering the women went through, they were convinced that this was an experimental craft from the US military and that it had caused their suffering and illness. As such, they filed a lawsuit against the US government in 1982. However, legal attempts to get answers from the government failed time and time again because it could not be proven that the UFO or the helicopters were US government property. Finally, in 1986, a judge dismissed the entire case, citing expert testimony that no such craft existed in the military. Over the years, there's been various theories as to what the Landrums and Betty Cash saw that night. The most popular, probably, is that this was an experimental military craft. This seems to be the most popular theory because the number of military helicopters seen in close proximity to the craft. Many feel the helicopters wouldn't have been able to get to the craft so quickly unless it was a military exercise. Others dispute this though and point out if the UFO had came down and had been ground level for some time, the military could have mobilized and reached it. The radiation from the craft also leads some people to believe that this was an experimental nuclear engine powered military craft. However, it's unlikely the military would fly something emitting radiation in the public. For something like this, they would almost certainly fly it in one of their restricted areas where only military is allowed. The second theory holds that this was indeed a UFO. This seems to be the theory that makes the most sense. The craft was described as 90 feet tall, and today, even 43 years later, we don't have anything that large capable of flying. Also, the fact that the Rendlesham Forest incident occurred and the radiation was non ionizing, yet caused immediate sickness, leads many to conclude it was from an unknown origin. John Schuessler, lead MUFON investigator on the Cash-Landrum case, concluded that the craft wasn't one of ours. The last theory holds that this event didn't occur. This seems extremely unlikely given the pain and suffering the witnesses occurred, both physically and mentally. The events would affect the rest of their lives. Also, the incident was seen by multiple witnesses. This case has been studied intensely for decades, and to date, we're no closer to solving this mystery than we were 40 years ago.